The Devastated Vineyard by Dietrich von Hildebrand. Part 1. Preface. Today we can no longer call the situation in the Holy Church the Trojan Horse in the city of God. The enemies who were hidden in the Trojan Horse have stepped out of their encasement, and the active work of destruction is in high gear. The epidemic has advanced from scarcely recognizable errors and falsifications of the Spirit of Christ in the Holy Church up to the most flagrant heresies and blasphemies. On the other hand, however, a great and promising improvement can be noted. The danger which threatens the Holy Church from within is being recognized more and more. Many who were deceived by such slogans as renewal, aggiornamento, and come out of the ghetto, have returned to orthodoxy. Various movements have been formed which are taking the offensive against the destruction of the Holy Church and the falsification of the Christian spirit. And above all, men in high ecclesiastical offices are also raising their voices now. The situation has become even more clearly one of an open battle between Satan and Christ, between the spirit of the world and the spirit of the Holy Church. The purpose of this book is, first of all, to give a short, clear presentation of the principal errors which are being presented today as a breakthrough to the modern man who has come of age, whom one can supposedly no longer expect to believe the teaching of the Church in the form it has now taken up to now. These errors, which in reality, however, are in no way new, and some of them have been expressly condemned by the Council of Trent, some by the First Vatican Council. We may thus speak here of forgotten anathemas. Secondly, we shall especially try to unmask those hidden, subtle errors which are usually introduced under beautiful, apparently noble titles, and whose danger is often overlooked even by believing Catholics. The awakening of many to all this, however, and the opposition which is growing daily to the distortion of the true spirit of the Gospels and of the Holy Church, must at present time fill us with hope. This, too, will be discussed briefly in this book. Against the background of the glory of divine revelation, of the miracle and the inconceivable gift which is the Holy Church, of the saints' victorious conquest over the spirit of the world, I want to show clearly what a disaster it is that such grave errors and such mediocrity have penetrated into the Church. And then I want to show that the steadily growing opposition to the devastation of the vineyard of the Lord is a kind of dawn, a consoling source of genuine hope for us. If I should succeed in this, then this book will have achieved its aim. Introduction. An unprejudiced look at the present devastation of the vineyard of the Lord cannot fail to notice the fact that a fifth column has formed within the Church, a group which consciously aims at systematically destroying her. They are referred to as the Mafia by some, including authorities in the Church. We have already pointed this out in earlier works. One alarming symptom is the fact that priests, theologians, and bishops who have lost their faith do not leave the Church, but rather remain with her. and indeed play the role of saviors of the Church in the modern world. Why do they not openly leave the Church, like Voltaire, Renan, and many others? Their systematic and artful undermining of the Holy Church testifies clearly enough to the fact that this is a conscious conspiracy involving Freemasons and Communists who, in spite of their differences and usual enmity in other matters, are working together towards this goal. For the Church is the arch enemy of Freemasonry, and is the principal hindrance to the Communists in their conquest of the world. Naturally, the Communists are incomparably more dangerous, but Freemasonry, though in theory and not so clearly antithetical to Christianity, is a welcome co-worker in the fifth column. The inconceivable thing is that this conspiracy exists within the Church, that there are bishops and even cardinals, and many priests and religious, who play the role of Judas. That such a fifth column exists is not merely my unauthoritative private opinion. On the contrary, a number of cardinals, bishops, and prelates have declared in private conversations that no one who is not blind can overlook this incredibly tightly organized fifth column within the Church. Of course, the number of religious who belong to this fifth column may be comparatively small, but they have a clear aim, coupled with a kind of intelligence that one finds in all Soviet and Chinese embassies, which should be more precisely characterized as slyness and cunning, to distinguish it from true intelligence. It must be emphasized from the outset, however, that the destruction of the Church is being sought from two completely different motives. In one case, it is the conspiracy which has existed at all times to undermine the faith and destroy the Church, with the sole difference that those involved do not want to undermine the Church from without, but rather from within. This is precisely the system of the fifth column. People who pretend to be Catholics, who assume offices in the Church, are sinking from within, under the banner of reform and progress, to destroy the Church. Completely different from these people are those who do not want to destroy the Church as such, that is, who do not seek the disappearance of the Church, but who rather want to transform the Church into something which completely contradicts her meaning and essence. This includes all those who wish to make the Church of Jesus Christ into a purely humanitarian society, to rob her of her supernatural character, to secularize and desacralize her. They share that camouflage of the enemies of the Church when it comes to using the shibboleths of reform, progress, and adaptation to modern man. But they do not want to eliminate the Church. The catchwords reform and progress are not mere tricks which they use. They really believe them. The result of the activity of this group is the same as that of the first group. Only their motives are different. This latter group would vehemently protest if one were to accuse them of intending the destruction of the Church. But they have lost the true Christian faith to such an extent that they do not clearly understand that the secularized humanitarian organization which they want to make out of the Holy Church would have nothing left in common with the Church of Jesus Christ. They do not see that if they were to reach their goal, it would amount to the destruction of the Church. Henry de Lubac, S.J., pointed this out with forceful and penetrating words. One becomes conscious that the Church is confronted with a grave crisis. In the name of a new church, a post-conciliar church, some people are tempted to found another church than that of Jesus Christ, an anthropocentric society, which is threatened by an immanentist apostasy, and which can be drawn into a movement of general surrender under the cloak of rejuvenation, ecumenism, and adaptation. Chapter 1. The Lethargy of the Guardians. One of the most horrifying and widespread diseases in the Church today is the lethargy of the guardians of the faith of the Church. I am not thinking here of those bishops who are members of the fifth column, who wish to destroy the Church from within, or to transform it into something completely different. I am thinking of the far more numerous bishops who have no such intentions, but who make no use whatsoever of their authority when it comes to intervening against the heretical theologians or priests, or against blasphemous performances of public worship. They either close their eyes and try, ostrich style, to ignore the grievous abuses as well as appeals to their duty to intervene, or they fear to be attacked by the press or the mass media and defamed as reactionary, narrow-minded, or medieval. They fear men more than God. The words of St. John Bosco apply to them. The power of evil men lives on the cowardice of the good. It is certainly true that the lethargy of those positions of authority is a disease of our times, which is widespread outside the Church. It is found among parents, college and university presidents, heads of numerous other organizations, judges, heads of state, and others. But the fact that this sickness has even penetrated the Church is a clear indication that the fight against the spirit of the world has been replaced with swimming along with the spirit of the times in the name of aggiornamento. One is forced to think of the hireling who abandons his flocks to the wolves when one reflects on the lethargy of so many bishops and superiors who, though still orthodox themselves, do not have the courage to intervene against the most flagrant heresies and abuses of all kinds in their dioceses or in their orders. But it is most especially infuriating when certain bishops, who themselves show the lethargy towards heretics, assume a rigorously authoritarian attitude towards those believers who are fighting for orthodoxy, and who are thus doing what the bishops ought to be doing themselves. I was once allowed to read a letter written by a man in high position in the Church, addressed to a group which had heroically taken up the cause of the true faith, of the pure, true teaching of the Church and the Pope. This group had overcome the cowardice of good men, of which St. John Bosco spoke, and ought thus to have been the greatest joy of the bishops. The letter said, as good Catholics, you have to do only one thing, just be obedient to all the ordinances of your bishop. This conception of a good Catholic is particularly surprising at a time in which the coming age of the modern layman is continually being emphasized. But it is also completely false for this reason. What is fitting at a time when no heresies occur in the Church without being immediately condemned by Rome becomes inappropriate and unconscionable at a time when the uncondemned heresies wreak havoc within the Church. infecting even certain bishops, who nevertheless remain in office. Should the faithful at the time of the Arian heresy, for instance, in which the majority of the bishops were Arians, have limited themselves to being nice and obedient to the ordinances of these bishops, instead of battling the heresy? Is not fidelity to the true teaching of the Church to be given priority over the submission to the bishops? It is not precisely by virtue of their obedience to the revealed truths, which they received from the magisterium of the Church, that the faithful offer resistance. Are the faithful not supposed to be concerned when things are preached from the pulpit which are completely incompatible with the teachings of the Church? Or when theologians are kept on as teachers who claim that the Church must accept pluralism in philosophy and theology, or that there is no survival of the person after death, or who deny that promiscuity is a sin, or even tolerate public displays of immorality, thereby betraying a pitiful lack of understanding for the deeply Christian virtue of purity. The drivel of the heretics, both priests and laymen, is tolerated. The bishops tacitly acquiesce to the poisoning of the faithful. But they want to silence the faithful believers who take up the cause of orthodoxy, the very people who should, by all rights, be the joy of the bishop's heart, their consolation, a source of strength for overcoming their own lethargy. Instead, these people are regarded as disturbers of the peace. And should it happen that they get carried away in their zeal and express themselves in a tactless or exaggerated manner, they are even suspended. This clearly shows that cowardice which is hidden behind the bishop's failure to use their authority, for they have nothing to fear from the orthodox. The orthodox do not control the mass media or the press. They are not the representatives of public opinion. And because of their submission to ecclesiastical authority, the fighters for orthodoxy will never be as aggressive as the so-called progressives. If they are reprimanded or disciplined, their bishops run no risk of being attacked by the liberal press and being defamed as reactionary. The failure of the bishops to make use of their God-given authority is perhaps, in the practical consequence, the worst confusion in the Church today. For this failure not only does not arrest spiritual diseases, heresies, and the blatant as well as the insidious, and this is much worse, devastation of the vineyard of the Lord, it even gives free rein to those evils. The failure to use holy authority to protect the holy faith leads necessarily to the disintegration of the Church. Here, as with the appearance of all dangers, we have to say, principis obsta, stop the evil at its source. The longer one allows an evil to develop, the more difficult it will be to root it out again. This is true for the upbringing of children, for the state, for the life of the state, and in a special way for the moral life of the individual. But it is true in a completely new way for the intervention of the ecclesiastical authorities for the good of the faithful. As Plato says, when evils are far advanced, it is never pleasant to eliminate them. Nothing is more erroneous than to imagine that many things ought to be allowed to rage and do their worst, and that one ought thus to wait patiently until they subside of their own accord. This theory may sometimes be correct with regards to youths going through puberty, but it is completely false in questions of the bonum commune, the common good. This false theory is especially dangerous when applied to the bonum commune of the Holy Church, involving blasphemies in public worship and heresies which, if not condemned, go on poisoning countless souls. Here it is incorrect to apply the parable of the wheat and the tares. Chapter 2. Is there only one contemporary philosophy? In our book entitled Trojan Horse in the City of God, and the introduction to Celibacy and the Crisis of Faith, we spoke of many of the bad tendencies and grave heretical errors which were and still are wreaking havoc in the post-consular church. Nowadays they are no longer being proclaimed so much as great novelties and discoveries, but rather are assumed by many to be self-evident, and to require no further discussion. This is also true of the theories of the arch-heresiarch, Teilhard de Chardin. In his book Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote that if one repeats something continually, even if it is not in fact true, it will nevertheless ultimately be considered self-evident. This observation about the way in which the masses can be influenced is perhaps the only true thing found in this deplorable book. We fully intend to analyze dangerous new tendencies and disastrous errors. However, let us again note two fundamental points briefly at the outset: the legend or myth of modern man and historical relativism. We showed in Trojan Horse and Celibacy and the Crisis of Faith that this modern man does not exist. He is an invention of the sociologists. As long as one refers to the immense change in the external conditions of life brought about by the enormous technological development which has taken place, when one is referring to an indubitable fact. But this outward change has had no fundamental influence on man, on his essential nature, on the sources of his happiness, on the meaning of his life, on the metaphysical situation of man. And yet only some such fundamental change in man would have any bearing at all on his ability to understand the language in which the Church has been announcing the gospel of Christ to mankind for thousands of years. A modern knowledge of history and an unprejudiced view of it could not fail to convince anyone that the modern man, who is radically different from the men of all other periods, is a pure invention, or rather a typical myth. As to historical relativism, which unfortunately is influencing many Catholic theologians, let us emphasize once again how serious this is, and how radically incompatible with the revelation of Christ. Here objective truth is replaced by a historical sociological reality. This historical aliveness of certain ideologies and attitudes is confused with their truth, validity, and value. The categories of truth and falsity have been replaced by the question of whether something is effective in the present age or belongs to a former age, and whether it is current or superannuated, alive or dead. Whether something is alive and dynamic seems more important than whether it is good and true. This substitution is an obvious symptom of the intellectual and moral decay. In former times, when certain ideas and ideals gained a great influence over the minds because of their historical vigor, their adherents were nevertheless convinced of their truth and value. But today, the interpersonal historical reality of an idea is alone enough to cause people to rave about it and feel sheltered in it. The most striking example of the exclusive interest in the historical social aliveness and the concomitant elimination of the question of truth is the God is dead drivel, and to the extent to which this expression is taken seriously. We must address in greater detail an aspect of this dependence on the spirit of the age, which we have not yet discussed as such. One can hear the opinion, even from Catholics, who still hold fast to the depositum Catholicae fidei, the deposit of Catholic faith, that it is praiseworthy of many theologians to build bridges to contemporary philosophy, to express the message of Christ, without, of course, sacrificing any of its content, in the language and with the concepts of contemporary philosophy. And here the question arises, is there any such thing as a single contemporary philosophy? Though, no, there is truly not one contemporary philosophy. We find in many epochs in history different and sometimes fundamentally opposed philosophies. One may be more widespread and have more adherents, but a variety of schools of thought has characterized every era in which there was active philosophical inquiry. Parmenides and Heraclitus, who were certainly different and indeed opposed in their philosophies, belong more or less to the same historical epoch. The same is true of Socrates and the Sophists. How many different and opposing schools of philosophical thought we find in Hellenism. But at the present time, less than ever before, one can speak of contemporary philosophy, insofar as one can still speak of philosophy at all in the authentic sense of the word. Our epoch contains completely different and opposing philosophies. We find positivistic empiricists of all varieties, pragmatists, logical positivists, all kind of materialists, disciples of Kant, Hegel, and Heidegger, Thomists such as Maritain, Gilson, and Marcel Descartes, thinkers like Gabriel Marcel, who cannot be classified in any school, and finally, those who are exponents of Augustinian realism. Which one is the contemporary philosophy? At most, one could speak of certain characteristics which are found in many of the above-listed philosophies, such as immanentism and subjectivism, epistemological and historical relativism, moral relativism, and atheism. These disastrous errors can indeed be found in many of the above-named philosophical schools. But, thank God, there are many other schools in which they cannot be found, such as among the Thomists or Gabriel Marcel. And especially those defenders of the objective truth who have a deep affinity with St. Augustine. Divine revelation presupposes implicitly certain absolute fundamental truths which can be known by natural reason. As I pointed out in Chapter 6 of the Trojan Horse, all forms of relativism, immanentism, materialism, determinism, and subjectivism are absolutely incompatible with Christian revelation. It is nonsense to assume that, instead of refuting these errors on a purely rational level, instead of unmasking their completely unproved character, and even their inner contradictions, one can build bridges to them, and that one ought to formulate the teachings of the Church in a terminology which has been molded by these errors. And it is a pure illusion to expect thereby to be better understood by our contemporaries, and especially to pave the way for them to the true faith. The devastation of the vineyard of the Lord is manifested in a most disastrous way in progressivist theology. In The Trojan Horse in the City of God, we have already pointed out many of these heresies. The apostasy from the true faith, which is not conceded to be apostasy by those who proclaim it, but is instead an aggiornamento, has become much more widespread since 1967. It has increased alarmingly both in extent as well as in distance from authentic Christian belief. If we think of the pluralism of Rahner, or of Schillebeeck's denial of the immortality of the soul, and of the difference between body and soul, or Marlet's denial of a transcendent God, or the claim of Gregory Baum that God reveals himself in the spirit of the age, or Kung's denial of the infallibility of the Church in matters of faith and morals, or many others, then we can see with shocking clarity how the devastation of the vineyard of the Lord is progressing. It is shocking because all these theologians are continuing to hold classes and give lectures, and to proclaim themselves Catholics. Shocking because they have neither been relieved of their offices and suspended, nor officially condemned. How can this irresponsible activity in the area of theology do anything else but slowly ruin and destroy the Church? It certainly happened in certain epochs in which there was a great fear of heresy, that many things were wrongly believed to be incompatible with the teaching of the Church. Thus it is not possible to interpret Descartes' writings as incompatible with the teachings of the Church, if they are correctly understood and judged in themselves, and not according to their historical influence. This is not by any means to say that errors do not crop up in his philosophy alongside his great insights. But the question is whether a thesis contains a contradiction to the fundamental natural truths which are tacitly presupposed in the revelation of Christ. But as soon as it is a question of a philosophical school, which, as mentioned above, is absolutely incompatible with Christian revelation, then there can be no pluralism in the Church. A philosophy such as Spinoza's, in which God is not a person at all and a man has no free will, and indeed is not a substance at all, can never be objectively reconciled with the Depositum Catholicae Fidei. As regrettable as was the overly anxious attitude of the Church in certain epochs, and the widespread mistrust of all philosophy which is not strictly Thomistic. Nevertheless, this narrowness still cannot be compared with the evil of present-day pluralism. It leads to terrible consequences when philosophies which are absolutely incompatible with the deposit of the Catholic faith, such as all varieties of transcendental idealism and even out-and-out relativism, can be taught at Catholic universities without hindrance. Though these theories may be branded as false by the Holy Father when speaking to a small group, nevertheless, as long as those espousing such philosophies, be they laymen or priests, are permitted to teach at institutions which call themselves Catholic, they can effortlessly undermine the faith of countless people and also destroy all sense of how irreconcilable certain false philosophies are within the Orthodox faith. A kind of schizophrenia is being bred through all this. An unfortunate false notion of caritas, an overemphasis on unity at the expense of truth, is a false Irenicism. All these are reasons for the tendency to want to unite irreconcilable things for as long as possible. Whereas the former narrowness was no danger to orthodoxy, the toleration of the spreading of theories which are in contradiction to the deposit of Catholic faith presents a mortal danger to orthodoxy. Chapter 3. The false idea of a middle way between extremes. One can sometimes hear propounded the unfortunate thesis that opposite errors are equally dangerous. It is assumed that because something is false or exaggerated, because one renounces it as extremist, that its opposite must be just as false and dangerous. It is forgotten that there is a hierarchy of evils, a hierarchy of dangers, and the fact that these evils and errors are opposite in no way proves that they are equally evil and equally dangerous. A heresy cannot be placed on the same level as an undesirable attitude of mind. If I juxtapose laxity and rigorism, I can call the former too little and the latter too much, but never can a heresy be compared in this way to a narrow-minded attitude which represents no heresy. In relation to heresies there is no minus malum, no lesser evil, apart from the fact that certain heresies can be weightier and worse than others. In politics, the insight that there is a minus malum is indispensable and basic. But if it is a matter of opposed tendencies in the Church, then the decisive difference is whether they are heretical or only unfortunate, exaggerated, narrow-minded. A short while ago, a well-known and important French theologian, who deplores the present devastation of the vineyard of the Lord, said to me that integrists were just as bad as the modernists. According to him, the integrists, who see everything which is not strictly Thomistic as heretical, were, through their spiritual and intellectual narrowness, as great a danger as the progressivists, who want to introduce pluralism in the Church, or a Hans Küng, who denies the infallibility of the Church. This is obviously a great error. The narrowness of the integrists may be regrettable, but it is not heretical. It is not incompatible with the teachings of the Holy Church. It views certain philosophical theses as inseparable from orthodoxy, though they in no way are. But these philosophical theses are also in no way incompatible with Christian revelation. Therefore, it is completely senseless to place those who hold a philosophic thesis to be inseparable from the Christian revelation, that is, from the teaching of the Holy Church, on a level with those who promulgate philosophic theses, which are in radical contradiction to the teachings of the Holy Church, of which we spoke in the last chapter. But there are many philosophical questions which do not have this relation to Christian revelation. To be sure, the alternatives of the truth or falsity of the thesis remain, but its incompatibility with orthodoxy is not at stake. Whether someone accepts the thesis that nil erit in electu quod non fuerit insensibus, or that he concurs with the Augustinian view on the point that has nothing to do with orthodoxy. But it is not difficult to see that whoever believes and proclaims fundamental errors which are absolutely incompatible with the Christian revelation is clearly a heretic, whereas someone who holds the philosophical thesis to be indispensable, which in themselves have no necessary relation to Christian revelation, become thereby in no way a heretic. But apart from the grave mistake of placing both on the same level with regard to content, it is still a great mistake to believe that the integrists, who have always been present, and who are pious, orthodox men, are just as dangerous to the Church as the declared heretics, including many who want to demolish the Church, the fifth column, or to remake her according to their own theories. This attack from within is being conducted with all available means and propagated by the mass media. It is an epidemic which is growing more widespread every day. This is a real danger, a disintegration of the Church. With the integrists, on the other hand, there can be no question of such a danger. But there can be very different reasons for this short-sightedness of equating two so incompatible evils. I am speaking here only of cases in which, for example, a completely orthodox priest, who deeply deplores all the present-day heresies, falls victim to the theory that both extremes are more dangerous and that truth lies in the middle. One reason is that often the Mitosis theory, which indeed is applicable to many spheres, is carelessly extended to spheres where it does not apply at all. We have discussed this in detail in the Trojan Horse, where we said that the truth does not lie in the middle between two extremes, but is rather above and beyond them. While I can meaningfully say that something should not be too cold nor too warm, not too bright and not too dark, not too salty and not too bland, it makes no sense to say that one should not be too pious or not pious enough, too virtuous or not virtuous enough. All the more it is meaningless to say that the person is too orthodox and that one is not orthodox enough to claim that truth lies in the middle. Orthodoxy is the truth, and all heresies are not forms of extremism. They are not exaggerations. They are simply false, incompatible with the revelation of Christ. It may be that psychologically one heresy springs from an overemphasis on one truth at the expense of another. But the heresy itself cannot be ever viewed as one extreme to which is opposed the contrary extreme of too orthodox. Rather, it is just false, not true. There is another reason why many have been seduced into placing incomparable errors on the same level, and it is purely psychological in nature. Men who have had to suffer much under the narrowness of spirit of the extremists, and who have been unjustly suspected of being heretics, have developed such an antipathy towards this fanaticism, and they shun and fear it so much, that they are inclined to put this evil on the same level as the grave errors of faith, or indeed as explicit heresies. It is actually quite seldom the case that men are completely objective in their judgments. Personal experiences, especially the most painful ones, usually play a role and make an evil seem to be greater than it objectively is, or vice versa. If one is treated in a friendly and respectful manner by a person, one will pass more favorable judgment on this person or the school of thought which he represents, although one had once seen the danger of it clearly, and although it has not in reality changed in any respect. To take another example, the judgment of superiors or bishops is often clouded because they believe that obedience and submission are more important than orthodoxy. Of course, I am thinking here only of those who are orthodox themselves, and who deplore all heresies. But the insult to God which is embodied in heresy is often not as tangible and irritating for them as a public act of rebellion against their authority. Certainly they should also make use of their authority if the subordinates are disobedient. But the first priority in authoritative intervention must be given to the question of whether the subordinate champions the truth in matters of faith and morals. A person who, because he has suffered from the narrowness of the integrists, regards them just as dangerous as progressives, is guilty of a lack of objectivity similar to that of such bishops. By the way, there is much talk of the legalism which must be overcome. Indeed, many even describe the Decalogue as legalistic, but in truth a greater, more real legalism has come into being since the Second Vatican Council. We have just pointed to one symptom of the real legalism in the negative sense, that more use of authority is being made in purely disciplinary matters than in matters of faith. The belief that a lack of discipline is more serious than a spread of heresies is a typical form of legalism. All disciplinary action, all obedience to the bishop presupposes the pure teaching of the Holy Church. Obedience to the bishop is grounded in complete faith in the teachings of the Holy Church. As soon as the ecclesiastical authority yields to a pluralism in questions of faith, it has lost the right to claim obedience to disciplinary ordinances.